I'll give you a bit of background to Shamini, then she's going to do some readings from 2 of her novels, and then she and I will have a bit of a chat about her work, and then we'll open up to you guys for questions. But just to give you a bit of a flavour of Shamini's life, Shamini lives in Singapore with her husband and 2 children, but she began her career in law in Malaysia, which is where Shamini's from, in some respects. And she also worked at an international law firm in Singapore. She travelled around Asia extensively for that work before resigning to be a stay-at-home mum, writer, part-time lecturer, and environmental activist, all in an effort, I like this, to make up for her evil past as a corporate lawyer. Shamini has sold over 1 million books since she started writing, so she is an expert in the genre. I know that you've written children's books, but obviously today we're looking specifically at the crime genre, and even more specifically about your series of books about the ubiquitous Inspector Singh, who has international adventures. So I think to set the scene and to introduce Inspector Singh, Shamini's going to read from 2 of those books, one set in... you've set your novels internationally, Bali, Malaysia, Singapore, Cambodia, India, and even the exotic United Kingdom, which I'm very interested to read. I haven't read that one. It's the latest one. But you're going to read from one set in China and one from the UK as well. So I'll hand over to you, Shamini.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me to your beautiful university. I'm planning to immediately do a PhD so that I can stay longer. I'm hoping to do a PhD in my own work so that I can limit the amount of research I have to do. Hopefully you don't have standards. In Malaysia, it's quite possible to do a PhD in your own work. Market yourself and award yourself a doctorate in under 2 weeks. But people find that too long, so they just get a degree from Thailand instead, which is 45 minutes, if you don't mind a faxed copy. I write crime novels. I've written 7 so far. Each one of them is set in a different country, and more importantly, each one of them comes in a different color. So if you can't remember the country, you can always just sort of say, I've read the yellow one, but not the purple one, which is what people do all the time. And then sometimes when it's a color like this and people are not sure what color it is, we sort of have an argument. Anyway. I'm going to read you a tiny bit from Inspector Singh Investigates in China. Inspector Singh is a Singapore police officer who ends up in different places investigating crime. I was listening to all the earlier panelists writing about crime but denying being crime writers. I am not ashamed. I write crime. I write crime because otherwise I fear I would commit crime. So this is safer. Superintendent Chen was ensconced in Singh's chair and fiddling with his BlackBerry. He did not look pleased. As Singh sauntered in, reeking of the cigarette he'd stopped to have in the car park, the boss looked at his watch, Rolex of course, and then back at Singh. You're late. I would be, if there was a fixed time that I was supposed to be here, said Singh, sitting down in the plastic chair fronting his own desk. He wondered why his boss was making himself comfortable in the seat that Singh had spent so many years shaping to fit his own ample contours. I thought you were desperate to get back to work after your Indian adventure, growled Chen. I am. But the citizens have become strangely law-abiding in my time away, complained the inspector. Not a single juicy murder all month. Low crime doesn't mean no crime, retorted the chief, quoting one of the Singapore Police Department posters. Singapore is such a peculiar place that they actually do have posters that say low crime doesn't mean no crime, in case we are not fearful enough of the sort of safe city that we live in. Low crime does mean no work, which is why I can be late, said Singh. I have nothing to do. I can fix that for you, said the superintendent. Singh sat up straighter, a glint in his eye, nostrils flaring. We have a murder? The other man paused. We don't have a murder? His superior remained silent. You'd like me to commit a murder? Superintendent Chen's expression suggested an outpouring of gastric juices had made contact with the resident ulcers in his stomach. Ulcers, he assured anyone who would listen, that were not caused by the criminal underclass, but by his recalcitrant Sikh inspector. I don't think you're the man for the job. You never do, said Singh. He left unsaid that he still had the best solve rate in the department. probably even better than the numbers suggested if you took into account the possibility that his colleagues frequently arrested the innocent. And I'm not in a position to venture an opinion, as I don't know what you're talking about, he continued. Unfortunately, tales of your latest Indian escapade made the newspapers in Singapore. This was true. The local press loved nothing better than a juicy story that had no Singaporean political implications. They called you the curry cop, continued Superintendent Chen, thin eyebrows drawn together in irritation. And the Papadum policeman, agreed Singh, not bothering to suppress a smile. He'd enjoyed the coverage. His wife had been offended, which added to his enjoyment. He'd even come up with a few nicknames himself, the Dal Detective and the Sarg Sleuth. But his wife had forbidden him from calling the newspapers to suggest these things. Reuters picked up the coverage as well, added Singh. Why were you solving murders in India anyway? You're supposed to be a Singapore cop. We sent you wouldn't let me come back to work after my Cambodian adventure, pointed out Singh. That was typical of you. We sent you to be an observer at the War Crimes Tribunal, and next minute you're chasing murderers across minefields. I went to India for a family wedding. It's not my fault if my wife's family is full of murderers. Singh paused, although I perhaps should have expected that. You didn't take the job seriously. That's the problem with you. I catch killers. What more do you want? Sensitivity to surrounding issues, said Chen. You don't care about stepping on toes with your big feet in your non-regulation shoes. Singh glanced down at his feet and wiggled his toes inside his sneakers. I run faster in these, said Singh, a man who had not voluntarily broken into a trot in 20 years. Superintendent Chen began to massage his left arm, and Singh wondered whether he was about to have a heart attack. If we did things your way, there'd be a lot of murderers walking the streets of Singapore, continued Singh. Everyone sleeps better at night because the curry cop is on the job. So that's a bit, which is obvious. Thank you. I've just realized I've read you a bit which is not actually in China because he hasn't got there yet. Sorry. You'll have to read. He always starts in Singapore and then has to find a reason to go overseas. Now, I've written 6 novels set in Asia. Malaysia, Bali, Singapore, Cambodia, China, and India. But for the 7th book, after a lot of persuasion, I managed to get the publishers to agree to let me set a book in England, in London. If you're Malaysian or Indian or Nigerian or anyone who writes in English, post-colonial literature, for lack of a better word, post-colonial crime, your entire formative reading and understanding of the world is through that heritage. You know, my mother quoted Shakespeare and the Bible. There's only 2 types of Malaysians: those who are proud of their colonial heritage in the sense they've absorbed all the Englishness, and those who are against it. You either support England in the World Cup or you boo England in the World Cup. But everything is still defined by our past. So, and every time you read a British crime novel, the cop will go overseas, right? You know, it's Poirot on the Nile. They're not happy unless they're coming out to the far parts of the world, the third world, you know, the dirty bits, helping the natives solve crime. So I wanted to send my cop, my Indian cop, back to England so that he could sort of have a reverse experience, you know, the Indian cop dealing with Scotland Yard rather than the other way around. And I'm just going to read a tiny bit to sort of give you a flavor of what it's like growing up with so much English literature in your head that you don't know truth from fiction. Epping Forest, they've just found a body in Epping Forest. Epping Forest, it sounded familiar. Or was he thinking of Sherwood Forest or Nottingham Forest? Come to think of it, wasn't that last a football club? That was the problem with London, with England. It featured so much in his reading, in his history lessons, in his father's propaganda, that he couldn't disentangle the past from the present, fiction from cold, hard, brutal fact. Jack the Ripper was real, but Robin Hood wasn't. The Moors' murders had happened, but Camelot was a dream of chivalry. What about the Scarlet Pimpernel? Singh had no idea. Macbeth was surely a creature of dark imagination, but Richard III was present and accounted for in the annals of history and had apparently died in a car park. Queen Elizabeth I had the heart and stomach of a king. Singh had only the stomach. But had anyone ever done a far, far better thing outside the pages of a book? And was he being assertive about the line between fact and fiction? After all, tall tales were based on kernels of truth. There had been a legendary figure called Arthur in the 5th or 6th century, but he had not pulled a sword from a stone. And that's kind of your experience growing up in places like Malaysia. You really don't know which bit of what you study and hear and read, positive or negative, is real or not. So what I like to think of is that I also write tall tales based on kernels of truth, or not. Thank you.
That was a particularly exciting excerpt for me because I lived next to Epping Forest. Oh, bodies, exactly. I was like, oh yeah, murders. So I just want to go back to something that you just said, actually. I think if you press the little button. Yeah. Ooh. Press it again. There we go. Showing my technical knowledge there. Turn it off and on again. So yeah, you've sort of stated quite proudly that you're happy to claim ownership of the title crime novelist. I know you came at it through law and children's fiction, so you're obviously sort of heading in that direction. What do you celebrate about the crime genre? What gift does it give you that those other employments didn't offer?
Well, the reason that I write crime is because actually, if you're a writer from Asia, it's far more traditional to write a literary work. There are only 7 internationally published Malaysian authors, and I know the other 6 very well, and they have all written the great Malaysian novel. So the way I see it is that actually being privileged or allowed to be an Asian writer writing genre fiction is the breakthrough. It's the rebellion. Next thing you know, we'll be doing chick lit and vampire stories. Because when you're published in the West, there's an expectation of the sort of book that you want to see. It has to have multi-generational families. You have to have references to immigrants and people living in a small room in the West, at least 100 crammed in. You have to have this, you have to pander, and I say this in the nicest possible way, you have to pander to what the reader is expecting. And I don't think it's actually you readers, I think it's the publisher. So when you're a Malaysian and you come with a book, if it's not the great Malaysian novel, which involves at least 3 generations of women, one has to have been raped, ideally by a Japanese soldier. Everything that they've done has been determined by fate, because some soothsayer would have told them that they were born under an unlucky star, and of course their lives would have been hideous for generations afterwards. And that's actually not what life is like in Asia. Asians are the least interested in their history people that I have ever come across, because we're all still trying to break away from our past as immigrants of being poor. We're all still trying to get on the sort of opportunity ladder where it's all about education, it's about jobs, it's about getting a professional qualification. So the fact that all our fiction represents us as being tied to history, tied to fate, having no individual volition, offends me. So I wanted to write an Asian book about nasty, ordinary Asian people killing each other for perfectly reasonable, rational reasons based in the present, not about, their history. Yeah, so I actually think writing crime is a breakthrough for a Malaysian writer because there aren't any others.
And obviously, Inspector Singh has been very successful internationally. How is he received in Malaysia? What do Malaysian readers get from him?
Well, my first book was called Inspector Singh Investigates a Most Peculiar Malaysian Murder. And I was listening to one of the earlier authors saying, it's much more valuable to be shelved in crime fiction because you sell a lot of books. But a most peculiar Malaysian murder, this being Malaysia, was shelved under true stories. Because, as you know, our Prime Minister is often accused of various sins, including murder. And I sold so many books because people thought the truth was out. And when they read it, they were like, but this is boring compared to real Malaysian stuff. And I was like, yeah, sorry. So yeah, I actually get shelved under true stories, even though I like to think I made it up. Because truth in these countries are much stranger than anything fiction can achieve.
Yeah. So I'm interested, so you started writing about him in Malaysia. You then have taken him on a now truly international, intercontinental journey. Why did you do that? I mean, I think so far today we've talked a lot about writing about places that you come from, that you're very familiar with. You're obviously going and exploring places that you perhaps don't know so well and writing about them. Why did you do that? Is that something that Inspector Singh just requires as a character? Was it to your own ends? What was the motivation to take him off on these great adventures?
Yes, I mean, it's become a thing that each Inspector Singh book is set in a different country or city. But when I first wrote the first one, it wasn't even clear to me that there was going to be a sequel and where that sequel was going to be. But being an ex-lawyer, or being a lawyer because I don't think you can lose it so easily, being interested in contemporary Asian culture and politics and law and society, I wanted to explore issues that I found interesting as a lawyer in fiction. So in a sense, each of my books deals with real-life political, legal issues in those countries, which I think don't get aired enough because they're just not that important, because they don't apply to the majority of the people in that country unless you fall foul of the law or something. And so the business of going from place to place allowed me to talk about different issues. So for instance, The Most Peculiar Malaysian Murder talks about the environmental destruction of the Malaysian rainforest, which is all part of the corrupt government plus corrupt businessmen thing in Malaysia. But Malaysia is also quite an interesting place. You guys probably won't know this. Most people don't. But Malaysia has two legal systems. It has a secular system based on the system we inherited from the British, but it's also got an Islamic system, a Sharia system, which applies only, so far, to domestic matters pertaining to Muslims. So both parties have to be Muslim. It has to be a domestic matter, which means family, divorce, custody, inheritance, but not criminal law. And then you appear before the Sharia court. But what's happened in Malaysia that's really interesting is that couples who are part Muslim, part non-Muslim, one party will try and take it before the Sharia court. The other party will be trying to take it before the civil court. Whichever court takes jurisdiction, one party will feel unrepresented by the law that they are being judged by. And it's become a thing that when two non-Muslims get divorced and they're fighting over custody, one will convert to Islam in order to appear before the Sharia court, which tends to give custody to the Muslim parent if there are two parents and one is non-Muslim, just to get custody. So it's become this whole, fake. And so in my book, the woman murders her husband, well, allegedly murders her husband, because he's converted to Islam and gotten custody of the children. And so left with no recourse before the courts, he is shot and she's thought to have done it. So that's an issue that you can only bring up in Malaysia. So in Bali, my father lives in Bali. My father is one of these people who ends up washing up in dodgy islands where he drinks beer with odd characters. He appears in all my books. It's not pretty, and yet he's happy. As long as he's in it, he doesn't care whether he's portrayed well. He's the sort of father where you inevitably become a writer regardless of... Anyway, let's not go there. Let's not air our personal troubles here. But he was living in Bali during the Bali bombings of 2002. And it was a very interesting time in Asia because it's become so frequent, but it was the first time that a large terrorist attack had ever happened in Southeast Asia. So it really changed the way we thought about our safety and our security and the kinds of things that we were afraid of. And so it's become so relevant again. But I was trying to write a book about the post-terrorist attack Bali society, because it's an interesting place, right? It's a Hindu island in a Muslim country which caters a lot to the tourist trade. So it is an intersection of so many different peoples and cultures and religions. So there was a book there. Singapore, homosexuality is still illegal in Singapore, whether consensual or otherwise. Again, it doesn't really affect a large portion of the population, and the law is not enforced, but I think it's appalling that such a law still exists on the statute books. It sort of dates from British times. Homosexuality is described in the law, and I think it's the same in the Indian statutes and probably in the Nigerian ones as well, as carnal intercourse against the order of nature. So in my book, a homosexual man who's about to be outed is suspected of murder. So I try and bring in relevant issues that I think are worth airing in a crime novel, but have a Sikh copper who's quite humorous and try and keep it light, but still say what I'm trying to say.
So in doing that, have you discovered, I don't know if this even applies, because it might be incidental, because they're all just good stories, but do you find yourself sort of celebrating universal themes? People have always and will always, murder each other and, betray each other and commit petty crimes and want things they don't have. Do you find that you're tending to demonstrate similarities between all peoples, or that you're finding differences that need investigating or exploring somehow? Or both? Or neither?
Yeah. I think I strongly, because I also write for children, I strongly believe in this sort of universality of human values. When Lee Kuan Yew says, well, he doesn't say it anymore because he's dead, but when Lee Kuan Yew used to say that, there's Confucian values which have a different understanding of democracy, and I'm like, fuck you, there's no such thing, right? You're just making that up because it's convenient. If Asians say, well, we still have, homosexuality is still illegal, but we should worry about poverty first and, economic growth, and we'll come to this later, and anyway, we don't prosecute. That's not acceptable because it doesn't matter what society you're from, there should be some fundamental truths, individual freedoms. If you don't mess with other people, you should be left alone. Democracy, a vote, a free press. So I don't like the way we fudge a lot of these issues in Asia and pretend that we're going to get there eventually, because I think we've demonstrated over the last bunch of years all over the world that we don't get there eventually. We have to keep asking and keep fighting for these things that people keep saying, just wait a little while and we'll deliver everything you want, but let's just get comfortable first. So there is a universality of sort of human values that I want to discuss. But as against that, I also want to show that Asians are normal people, and if provoked, we will kill each other. But some of the reasons that we kill each other are different from what you're used to. So human, but different, I guess.
Great.
But also, actually, that I lie, because the reason I have murders in my book is because I don't know how to tell a story without a death. You have all these great writers, and people come together in their books and they talk about things. Why? Why would you get together in a room and start exposing your inner soul? I would never do that. I'd just make some jokes and leave. So with a murder, you get people like a cop being allowed to ask questions, and then they have to answer, because otherwise you go to jail. And that allows me to write all these other things. Because otherwise, I have no idea at all why people would have a proper conversation about anything. You need a body. As a catalyst to conversation.
So death, and specifically murder, is a catalyst to you for writing. I mean, that in terms of sort of, I was thinking about format, because obviously you've written 7 now.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you are now finding that you have a kind of a formula that you take a dead person or take a living person and kill them and then see what happens. I mean, does that happen when you write, or are they all just stories that are waiting to be found?
Well, I usually start with an issue. So something's caught my attention. In China, I wrote the China book because remember that Bo Xilai guy? He was like the new prince of Chinese politics. Next thing you know, he's in jail and his wife's in jail and murdered that British guy, and it was all very exciting. I was like, ooh, story. What was the question again? I got excited over
formula.
the whole... Yes, formula. So yes, I do try... Well, you see, because I'm writing genre fiction set in Asia, in the present, I have actually intentionally kept to a very traditional crime structure, because I think it's too much to ask a reader to understand an individual Asian society, their law, their culture, and then make the book complicated as well. The narrator never does it in mine, because I want the structure to be sufficiently simple. Body, policeman, investigation, motives, so that the rest of the story can be captured without too many elements of the book being challenging. I mean, I keep getting letters from people saying, I'm very interested by this book about Singapore, but I thought Singapore was part of Australia. Those are not the sorts of people, I mean, mostly Americans, but those are not the sort of people you want to also make the crime structure complex, right? I mean, you'll never sell a book. And then what's the point of writing all these complicated stories about Asian society if nobody reads them, right?
Yeah. So I was going to say, because also you obviously make them, I mean, they are light-hearted in some ways. There's comedy inherent in how you write. And I was wondering, again, I mean, when I was reading about you, one of the things that you state is that you see or saw when you started writing that writing was a vehicle to affect change in some way. And so I'm interested personally in comedy as making things digestible for people, and they can consider everything else subsequently or sort of accidentally. I mean, is that something that you, again, there's a gift of, crime, this template that you have, that you can actually talk about issues and reveal things to people without them realizing that you're doing it?
I think the humor, first of all, because I write about quite serious subjects, the humor is in the policeman himself, in his attitudes and his perspectives and his disgust with immigration queues and bad food and, warm beer. So the humor, because, for instance, the Cambodian book is all about the genocide in Cambodia and the war crimes tribunals that have been going on. And my publisher said to me, we really love the story, but it's not funny enough. And I was like, there's limits to what I can do, with the genocide. I am sort of losing my sense of humor here. So the humor is in the policeman rather than in the content. But I deal with issues two ways, right? People die or people laugh. I don't know any other way to do it. So I try and combine both in my books.
Great. Now, one of the questions, I sort of resist asking this question, but it is, even in the context of today, it has to be noted that you are a woman, you happen to be a woman writing crime fiction. Does that ever manifest in, your practice or how people receive you? Does it come up other than because it is expected that you're going to be asked about it?
Well, one of the peculiar things about Asian society is, or at least Malaysian society, I won't speak too broadly, is that when I was brought up, even though I was a girl, and there were various issues related to being a girl that I suffered. I was too tall, I was too dark, my hair was too short, I was never going to get married. If only. But it was still expected that I would study, I would do well, I would get a job, ideally a professional job. I would also get married and have children and bring them up perfectly to study and do well and have children. But being a female was not limiting educationally or in terms of ambition or aspirationally. And when I worked in law, even though I was in Malaysia and it's a Muslim country and stuff, I never had any issue with sexism, ever. And then I worked for an English firm, Linklaters, with lots of English lawyers. And for the first time in my life, I was exposed to rampant sexism. I just couldn't believe it because it was like, white people, weren't you supposed to be past this? But if they were talking about football and I tried to join in, I have an obsession with football, soccer, they'd be like, why are you trying to talk to us? This is our thing. And they'd go out for a drink and they wouldn't invite you along. But if you had a very heavy bag full of law books, they'd want you to carry it yourself because that was the moment that your, feminist time had arrived. While in Malaysia, they carried your books for you if they were too heavy, but still let you be a good lawyer. It wasn't a physical divide. You can recognize differences without making them an issue. So that was a huge shock to me. But I always get a bit nervous writing as a woman or writing as a brown person, because you can keep finding reasons to be a minority, right? Short hair, bad attitude, arthritic fingers. The list, I think it's very dangerous for us to keep looking for ways to identify as different. And in a way, the reason I write crime and write Asian society as it exists, in my view, as it exists now, is to stop treating us as the other, for Western readers to understand that we exist as people before we turn up as refugees on your doorstep. That it's possible to visit Australia by plane as opposed to by boat. It's a sense that we have a life that doesn't immediately become relevant when we start doing nasty things in your public places. Because then you understand why not why we're driven to nasty things in public places, but why people end up coming to different places, doing different things, finding a new life. While you only see us at our worst or at our weakest, you got to understand that there's a full, complete, multi-generational, comprehensive life that is thwarted by an event, be it war, climate change, or whatever, and that's when we start to move. And it could just as well happen the other way around. And so that's why I want to sort of portray us as complete in ourselves for a Western reader.
Excellent. So let's talk specifically about Inspector Singh. Where was he born? How was he born in you? Like, where was the seed of him?
Inspector Singh started. I saw Inspector Singh on a bus. I was trying to think of you see, I did this very sort of logically, right? I was going to write crime, so I needed a policeman. So how do you pick a policeman? Well, he had to be Indian because I wanted to write from a perspective that I knew. And then I wasn't going to make him a Sikh because I'm not Sikh. But then I saw a Sikh man on a bus. And I thought, oh, you need something significant, right? And the turban is fantastic. People will remember him, and when they do the TV series, it'll be so easy. So I was like, Sikh, we're going to go with that. And then, of course, I remembered that in Singapore and Malaysia, Sikhs have often been part of the military, part of the police force, historically, when they came over from India. So it was actually quite natural that the policeman be a Sikh. But having started out with all those thoughts and having stolen from people I've met, from relatives and things, recently I realized that he sounds a lot like me. So I just may be a very complicated, overweight Sikh gentleman. Yeah, because he's got a sort of bitchy tone that I don't think would be entirely natural for a 50-year-old Sikh policeman. I don't think.
So
yes, he may be me. So I may play him in the movie with a pillow and a turban.
Oh, you heard it here first. That's an exclusive. There's definitely going to be a movie, and you are the star. Great. Do you find yourself then being able to use him as a kind of a mouthpiece for your opinions? I mean, having met you since yesterday, you have opinions, and you're not afraid to state them, I would confidently say. Does he give you even more of a kind of international platform?
Well, certainly he is a sort of conservative Indian gentleman of a certain age, but has an intrinsic understanding of justice and truth. And despite his laziness and his reluctance to get involved, after he's watched his underlings arrest the wrong people, he starts developing a sympathy for some member of the case, some person involved, the dead person, and begins to solve the crime. I mean, this whole Sikh thing turned into a terrible mistake because I didn't know I was going to write a series. So I wrote a single book with a Sikh policeman. And since then, I've had to fake Sikhness for 7 books in a row, which is difficult. And recently, I was at my mum's house in Malaysia, in KL, and a Sikh gentleman turned up at the front door. And I was like, shit, they've come to find me. They finally figured out that I've just been faking this all along. So I went and hid in the bathroom. And I said, Mummy, you go and deal with him. Turns out he was just asking for donations for a temple. But I now live in fear of Sikhs. You should be very careful when writing a first book that you think ahead. You never know what's going to happen.
So it's like an expose here today. So there's going to be a movie and you're not a Sikh policeman.
Yeah, well, I mean, funnily enough, jokes aside, I think that template of Indian family, extended family, community, which I experienced growing up as half Sri Lankan and half Indian, clearly applies just as well to the Sikh community within Singapore and Malaysia, because I don't get that many complaints despite my fears. A lot of people say to me, he's just like an uncle we have in the family. The black sheep who comes to the wedding or the funeral and stands outside and smokes a cigarette and doesn't want to discuss house prices. That uncle is Inspector Singh.
Yeah. Going back to him sort of being a mouthpiece or a kind of a vehicle for critique, have you had any response to some of the critique of different nations that you've sort of that come through in your writing? For example, in Calamitous Chinese Killing, there is some critique of Chinese politics, for example.
Some.
Can you buy that book in China?
Well, you can buy the book in China, but I'm not selling it myself.
Right.
Because I'm not stupid.
But it's not
In
censored.
fact, I went for the Shanghai Literary Festival and I had my book with me. And then I thought, what am I doing? I'm not going to walk into China carrying this book under my arm. So I tried very hard to flush it down the airplane toilet. It is not easy to flush a book down a toilet. I don't think that plane's working so well anymore. Yeah. No, it's actually really interesting when you write about small Asian countries. When I wrote about Malaysia, and I am Malaysian, so a lot of people were very offended. I got an email from someone saying, tourists won't come to Malaysia now because of what you've said. Because apparently it's not acceptable to write a normal story about normal people who might accidentally kill each other because you might drive the tourists away. And whichever country I write about, I either get emails from people from that country saying, that's wonderful, I'm really so happy somebody's finally said these things that need to be said. Or Indians, oh my God, I mean, they're not happy unless they're emailing me. How dare you talk about poverty in India? Haven't you seen that there are rich people too? I'm like, yes, yes, and there are some rich people in my book. It's a very defensive thing. I mean, I don't think any German would feel threatened by a book that is nasty about your country, right? And my books are not entirely nasty. They're very positive as well. But people really latch on defensively to whatever they don't like. Either that or they say, you know, I am the ex-commissioner of customs and excise of Hyderabad state. And if you come to India anytime, I will buy you a whiskey at my club. Those are the two sorts of emails I get. The whiskey at the club and the how dare you.
Do you respond?
Of course.
And how do you respond?
Tell them to fuck off.
Fair play.
I mean, I can't be. I'm not. If the tourist board pays me, I will write nice things about Malaysia and so on. In slogans.
Is there anyone here from the German Tourist Board? So we have about 10 minutes left, I think. So I'm just going to open up to the audience now, if anyone has any questions. I know we now have a roving microphone, so you two can be heard.
5 minutes left.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So we have 5 minutes if anyone has a question. And Nathan, did you have one? Yeah, I thought I could.
Sounds very combative.
Thank you, Lina.
Sorry. It's so lovely to hear you talk about Malaysia. It just reminds me of Nigeria. You know, same multiple legal systems, Sharia, only that we have 3 and not 2. I'm wondering what you think about, I mean, because people read your work, and so I think my question is about how people receive your work in Malaysia and how that compares to the way people receive your work outside.
It's a really tough question because, again, and I suspect very similar in Nigeria, in Malaysia, you're talking to so many different types of audience. So you have your English-educated, English-speaking, middle class, pretty much everyone's a lawyer. Half of them are in jail now because we have a very odd government. And they obviously love what I write. Then you get an entire sort of subset who are offended by what I write. And then you get the vast majority who can't read what I write because it's in English and not yet translated into Malay and the other sort of languages which I speak but don't speak well enough to write in. Anyway, it can't get published. Yeah, so it's different. I live in fear that someone in government will actually read my book because then it'll be ugly. But luckily in Malaysia and in most Asian countries, government is illiterate. So the odds of them reading my books are very slim. And I cross my fingers and hope that continues. In fact, in Malaysia, my first 2 copies of my new Inspector Singh I gave to 2 opposition members of parliament in Malaysia who are friends of mine. And they promised to read it in parliament the next time the Prime Minister was speaking. So I'm optimistic that I will soon A, get publicity, and B, not visit from Singapore anytime soon. Yeah, so I think, I mean, I don't worry about how the book is received in terms of its legal and cultural and political content, because there I'm saying what I want to say. I could stand on a box and shout, or I could write a book. I write a book. So I don't care whether people agree with me or not, because I just want them to think about the possibility that I might have a point, even if it's to disagree with me. If they criticize in terms of, you know, style of writing and all that, that's fine, because that's just, you know, technical issues. But I'm a lawyer. I'm not putting it out there for people to agree with me. I'm putting it out there in order to get a chance to argue with people. And ideally persuade them of my point of view, failing which at least to upset and annoy my relatives, for starters, who are all middle-aged conservative Indian people who don't like the fact that I've mentioned homosexuality in the book and who still think that there's no such thing in Singapore or Malaysia. It's something that happens to other people. You know, my mother, who edits my books, I mean, no sex in my books at all because my mother's still alive, and I just can't do that as an Indian female person. But not only that, she gets upset if Inspector Singh is unhygienic. So once I mentioned that he had dirty fingernails, and she's like in red pen, he can't have dirty fingernails. I was like, why not? It's not nice. So, I mean, can you imagine? I mean, with this sort of, you can't be writing for individuals within Asian society because they are going to get upset even about the dirty fingernails, let alone the crime and the drugs and the cops and the corruption and the everything else.
So you see writing as a kind of a provocation? Or
Not enough people read my books to provoke sufficiently, but yes, ideally that would be like, yeah.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has. Ooh, maybe not. In which case I can... Oh, yes, there's one there, just behind Tabish. Thanks, Tabish.
Okay. I would like to come back to this genre question. The notion that there are 7 Malaysian writers in English and or internationally published, and 6 of them write the great Malaysian novel. Maybe it's me, but I've not heard of them here. Are you sure that they are really traveling as far as you do?
You probably have heard of them. Well, I don't know. I mean, because they all write literary fiction, so they don't sell much. There's Tan Tuan Eng, who was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. There's Tash Au, who's won the Whitbread Prize for Young Novelists. There's Preeta Samarasan, who was shortlisted for the Orange Prize. So yeah, they do write very successful. But you may not get that they're Malaysian because all our names are different, right? Because Malaysia is a multiracial country. So some of them are Chinese and some of them are Indian and some of them are Malay, and you may not spot that they are necessarily Malaysian. All their books have very silly titles. Preeta, who's a good friend of mine, her book is called Evening is the Whole Day. And every time we meet, we say, but evening isn't the whole day. It's all this, publishers want these exotic sounding titles, right? Tan Tuan Eng's book is called Garden of Evening Mists. What does that even mean? I mean, Garden of Evening Mists. Yeah, so when I started writing, I had a lot of lawyer friends who said to me, you can write what you like, but if we see a mango in the cover, it's over between us. We don't want fruit, we don't want flowers, we don't want time of day, we don't want, nothing literary, nothing self-consciously literary, which is the other reason that I wrote crime, because most of my friends would have ditched me straight away if I'd written a book like that. I can't remember what Tash's new book is called, but it's got a map on the cover. You always know when they've got an old map on the cover where they're going.
Yes.
I mean, they're much better writers than me. Don't get me wrong. Go and read them. They're much better writers than me, but they have very stupid titles.
Yes, but before you read them, definitely read Shamini's Inspector Singh series. I highly recommend it. On that note, I think we should finish. Shamini, thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Join me in showing our appreciation.